Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail. Today we're going to share Wendigo horror stories. First story, the Wendigo of Algonquin. My name is Derek Shaw. I'm a survivalist, a man with a deep passion for nature and the wilderness. There's something about stripping life down to its basics. No tents, no gadgets, just me, the earth, and what I can pull from it. Over the years, I've spent more nights than I can count under the stars, in forests and mountains where most wouldn't dare tread alone. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened a few months ago. I've tried to push out of my mind, tried to bury the memory in the same way I bury my fire pits. But the truth has a way of gnawing at you, like the wind rattling branches in the dead of night. I guess I'm finally ready to tell my story. The story of the most horrific camping encounter of my life. It was in Algonquin, a place I thought I knew well. A place I loved. Now, I'll never look at it the same again. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs with each breath, and the snow crunched under my boots as I trudged deeper into the forest. I'd been to Algonquin countless times, but never here, never this deep into its untouched wilderness. That was the thrill of it, the unknown. A stretch of land where no trails led and no campers had likely ever set foot. I carried just enough gear to get by. A flint, a small hatchet, a few essentials, but the rest, as always, would come from the land. That's how I did things. The trees grew denser the further I went, their branches sagging under the weight of snow. The landscape was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional crack of a branch or the rustle of the wind whipping through the evergreens. It was that stillness, that isolation, that made my heart race in a way nothing else could. This part of the forest was new to me, untouched and wild. I could feel the excitement building as I scanned the terrain for a suitable campsite. After another hour or so of hiking, I found it. A small clearing nestled between two towering spruces, their branches arching above to form a natural canopy. The ground was blanketed in snow, but beneath it, I could make out a rise in the land, an ideal spot for shelter. I dropped my pack and stretched, surveying the space. It was perfect, untouched by human hands. The idea of being the first to camp here, to explore these woods, sent a rush of energy through me. I could already picture the fire crackling in the center of the clearing, my shelter set up against the wind. This would be home, at least the next few nights. Once the fire was going, the warmth of the flames began to melt the cold that had settled deep in my bones. The light flickered against the snowy backdrop, casting shadows that danced along the tree-line. I took a deep breath, savoring the stillness for a moment before getting to work on the shelter. I gathered branches from the nearby trees, testing each one for strength before laying them out in a rough framework. A simple lean-to would do for the night. I layered the branches with smaller brush to insulate against the wind, which had started to pick up. My movements were automatic. This was routine for me by now. But as I worked, something began to feel off. It was subtle at first, just a faint tug at the back of my mind. A strange sense that something was different. I paused for a moment, listening, but all I heard was the crackle of the fire and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I shook it off and kept working, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, the excitement of discovering new territory. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger with each passing minute. I stood up straight, wiping the sweat from my brow despite the cold, and glanced around the clearing. My eyes scanned the tree-line, searching for movement. Anything out of the ordinary, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, snow-covered woods. And yet, the sensation crept up my spine like a cold hand pressing against the back of my neck. It was irrational, I told myself. I was alone out here. I had to be. But there was something about the way the trees stood, the way the shadows seemed to shift just beyond the fire's reach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. I felt this way before, back in my early days of camping. That unsettling sense of being watched, always lurking just beneath the surface, gnawing at my nerves. I used to chalk it up to my imagination, the natural paranoia of being alone in the wilderness. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, that feeling never fully went away. After getting my camp set up, I decided to head out and forage. I had packed some emergency rations, but I always preferred living off the land. Mushrooms, berries, the occasional fish, if I got lucky. It was part of the challenge, part of why I loved survivalist camping. As the fire flickered behind me, I grabbed my small foraging sack and made my way into the trees, the snow crunching softly beneath my boots. It wasn't long before I found signs of life, a set of tracks leading off deeper into the forest. At first, I thought they were deer tracks. The pattern was familiar, but as I looked closer, something wasn't quite right. The prints were spaced strangely, almost like they'd been made by something walking on two legs rather than four. I crouched down, examining them more closely. Bipedal, but still shaped like hooves. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was silly, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Deer occasionally stand on their hind legs, especially when startled or trying to reach higher branches. It was rare, but not impossible. Still, something about these tracks felt off, unnatural. That's when the thought crept into my mind, the legend of the Wendigo. I had heard the stories before, whispered around campfires late at night. A monstrous creature that roamed the forests, once human, but transformed by a hunger that could never be satisfied. I shook my head, pushing the thought aside. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Just a story, a legend meant to spook children. Still, staring at those tracks, I couldn't help but feel the cold fingers of dread tightening around me. I decided to head back to camp, my mind still buzzing with thoughts of those strange tracks. On my way, I came across a fallen log, and there, clustered near its base, I found a patch of velvet-foot mushrooms, small, brown-capped fungi that thrive even in cold weather. I recognized them immediately. They were edible, and their resilience in these conditions always amazed me. Not much, but enough to complement the winter berries I'd gathered earlier. I carefully plucked a few of the mushrooms and made my way back to the camp, relieved to have found something familiar. Once there, I tossed a few more branches onto the fire, stoking the flames back to life. The crackle and warmth steadied me as I prepared a simple meal, grateful that the wilderness could still provide, even in the dead of winter. After eating, I settled into my shelter, letting the fire's warmth wrap around me as I lay back. The quiet of the forest was soothing, and the flicker of the flames lulled me into a sense of calm. Before long, I drifted off to sleep, but sometime deep into the night, something stirred me awake. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was a rhythm to the noise, a deliberate crunching sound, something moving slowly just outside the camp. My heart raced as I strained to listen, my breath freezing in the cold air. It wasn't the wind. Something was creeping around the perimeter of my camp, each step slow, calculated. Whatever it was close. I gripped my hunting knife tightly, my fingers tense around the handle as I listened. Whatever it was, it sounded large, but its steps were small, deliberate. It wasn't a bear. I'd encountered bears in the wild before, and they made much more noise, especially when trudging through snow. No, this was something else, something quieter, more cautious. As I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sounds, a strange, foul odor drifted through the air. It was faint at first, but quickly grew stronger. It smelled of decay, like something rotting, foul and unnatural. My stomach turned, and I felt a chill creep over me that had nothing to do with the cold. The fire was dying, its light fading fast. I couldn't let it go out, not with something creeping around out there. Slowly, I reached over and grabbed a few pieces of wood, throwing them onto the embers. Sparks flew up, and the fire flickered back to life, casting long, dancing shadows around the trees. I sat up, listening intently, knife in hand, trying to locate the source of the smell and the sounds. But as the wind picked up, the noises began to fade. It was as if whatever had been circling the camp was walking away, its footsteps growing softer and softer until they disappeared completely into the night. For a long time, I just sat there, my senses on high alert, waiting for the sound to return. But all I heard was the wind rustling through the trees. After what felt like an eternity of silence, I finally let myself relax a little, convincing myself that whatever had been there was gone. The rest of the night passed without incident, and despite the unease gnawing at the back of my mind, I eventually drifted off again. The forest remained quiet, almost peaceful, but that lingering sense of something watching me never truly left. The next morning, with the sun shining through the trees and the fire reduced to glowing embers, the events of the previous night felt distant, like a half-remembered dream. The unsettling sounds, the strange smell, all of it seemed like the product of an overactive mind, stirred up by the isolation. I packed up what little I had used and set off to forage again, my focus shifting back to the task at hand. The forest was calm, and the cold air felt refreshing. But as I wandered further from camp, that creeping sense of unease returned. It wasn't anything immediate, no sounds, no movement, just a feeling gnawing at the edge of my awareness. Then I saw them. Tracks in the snow. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down to get a better look. The same hoof tracks from yesterday. The same strange pattern, as though whatever left them was walking on two legs. And they were close. Too close. My camp wasn't more than 100 yards away, and these tracks, they circled it. I stood up, trying to shake off the rising dread. This didn't make sense. I had been sure it was just a deer or some animal, but seeing those tracks again, so close to where I had slept, it was unsettling. My mind raced with possibilities, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep moving. There was a logical explanation. There had to be. Then, a sharp crack pierced the stillness of the forest. A sound so loud it seemed to echo off the trees. It wasn't the rustling of wind or the snap of a small twig. It was deliberate, heavy, like a large branch snapping under the weight of something. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the dense forest where the sound had come from. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A large, hulking figure just at the edge of the trees, blending into the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out any details. But after a few agonizing moments of silence, the figure was gone. Or maybe it had never been there at all. I stood frozen, the tension building in my chest as my mind fought to rationalize what I had seen or thought I had seen. It had to be my imagination, the shadows playing tricks on me. I hadn't slept well, and the isolation was getting to me. That's all it was. I returned to camp, the strange feeling still clinging to me like a second skin. My mind kept drifting back to those tracks, the heavy snap in the distance, and that brief glimpse of something, if it had been anything at all. I shook it off and focused on gathering wood, deciding to collect more than I needed this time. If nothing else, I wanted the fire to burn strong through the night. As the day dragged on, that sense of being watched never left. It was subtle, like an itch I couldn't scratch, but always there, keeping me on edge. I tried to focus on my tasks, checking the perimeter, stoking the fire, but the unease gnawed at me. When the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, I could feel the tension rising again. Night fell quickly, and soon it was time to settle in. The wind had died down, leaving the forest eerily still. My fire crackled in front of me, the soft glow offering some comfort against the darkness pressing in from all sides. I lay down, pulling my sleeping bag tight around me, trying to relax. The fire was strong. The camp was secure. Everything would be fine. But then, deep into the night, I was jolted awake. A sound. No, a scream. It wasn't close, but it was loud enough to cut through the silence like a blade. A screeching wail, distant but piercing. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in the natural world. My heart leapt into my throat, and goosebumps rippled up my arms and neck. I sat up, the knife back in my hand before I realized it. Every muscle in my body was tense, my ears straining to hear anything else. I had heard animals cry out in the night before. Wolves, coyotes, even owls, but this was different. It was a raw, primal sound, full of something I couldn't place. Fear, anger, pain. I didn't know. But whatever had made it, I knew one thing for sure. I had never heard anything like it before. It was then that the realization hit me, hard and cold. I was no longer safe. The creature, whatever it was out there. And it was real. The tracks, the strange figure in the shadows, the eerie scream in the night. It had been watching me the whole time, waiting. I didn't know how long it had been lurking, but now, after that scream, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone out here. My mind raced, trying to piece together what to do next. My truck was about 5 miles away, parked near the edge of the trailhead where I had started. 5 miles through dense, dark forest with that thing, whatever it was, out there, stalking me. The thought of escaping, of getting out of these woods, gnawed at me. It was the only thing that made sense, the only chance I had. But then, just as I was starting to gather my thoughts, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft at first, distant, but unmistakable. They were slow, deliberate, as if whatever was out there wanted me to hear it coming. My pulse quickened and my grip on the knife tightened. The sound was getting closer, each step crunching in the snow, growing louder with each second. I sat frozen, staring out into the darkness beyond the glow of the fire, but I couldn't see anything. The flames flickered weakly now, casting shadows that danced against the trees. It was close, closer than it had been last night. My breath hitched as I tried to steady myself, but the pounding in my chest drowned out every rational thought. I wasn't ready for this. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the camp and head for the truck, but my legs wouldn't move. Fear rooted me to the spot, and all I could do was listen as the footsteps grew nearer, the air thick with the smell of decay once again. I had to make a decision. Stay and face whatever was out there, or make a break for it into the unknown darkness. Either way, the creature knew where I was. I had to run. There was no more time to think. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stay out there, circling my camp forever. I needed to get to my truck, back to the safety of civilization. The thought of fleeing surged through me like a bolt of adrenaline, but I knew I had to be smart about it, quiet. I didn't want to alert the creature until I had a head start. I moved quickly, my hands shaking as I tried to pack up my gear. My mind raced, trying to figure out the best route back. The forest was a maze in the dark, but the path wasn't entirely invisible. The snow, coupled with the bright moonlight, reflected enough that I could see through the trees, even if only barely. It was dangerous, but at this point, it didn't matter. I'd rather be lost out there than trapped with whatever was stalking me. I grabbed my bag and slung it over my shoulder, keeping my knife gripped tightly in my hand. The weight of the blade was reassuring, even though I wasn't sure it would do me any good. With one last glance at the dying fire, I stepped away from the camp, moving quickly but as quietly as I could. As soon as I was out of the small clearing, the sounds returned. The footsteps. They were behind me again, deliberate and slow, like the thing was pacing itself, just enough to keep up but not enough to attack. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it so loud in my ears that it drowned out everything else. I couldn't hear the wind or the crackle of snow under my boots, just my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears like a drum. I walked faster, trying not to break into a full run. Running would make too much noise. I needed to stay calm, but every fiber of my being was screaming at me to sprint, to flee into the darkness as fast as I could. I could feel it, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The footsteps were growing louder, keeping pace with me, as if it knew I was trying to escape. I clutched the knife tighter, my knuckles turning white. I had no idea how far I'd gone, or if I was even heading in the right direction. After what felt like an eternity of weaving through the dark forest, the trees finally began to thin out, and suddenly I stumbled onto the familiar main trail. Relief washed over me for a moment. This was the path that would take me back to my truck. I knew I had to head left, just a few miles to go, and I'd be safe. My legs burned from the cold and the tension, but I forced myself to keep moving, heart still racing in my chest. Then it happened. A scream, louder and more terrifying than the one I had heard earlier, shattered the silence. It wasn't just a sound. It was a visceral, blood-chilling wail that echoed through the trees, reverberating inside my skull. My entire body tensed, and without thinking, I spun around, knife in hand, my eyes scanning the forest behind me. That's when I saw it. Standing in the shadows just beyond the tree line, illuminated faintly by the moonlight filtering through the canopy, was the creature. Tall, emaciated, its skin clinging tightly to its bones, pale as death itself. Its eyes, glowing with a sickly, unnatural light, locked onto me. The creature was skeletal, its body unnaturally thin, and its mouth stretched into a horrific grin, showing rows of jagged teeth. But what struck me most were the horns. Massive, twisted antlers protruding from its head, casting long shadows over its sunken, hollowed face. The Wendigo. It was real. It wasn't just some legend, some old story to scare people around a campfire. It was here. It was hunting me. My blood ran cold, and for a moment, I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. The creature didn't move, but I could feel its hunger, its malice, radiating from it. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. This thing, this nightmare made flesh, wasn't going to let me leave the forest. I didn't wait for it to move. I bolted. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, down the trail, toward my truck, towards safety. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear behind me the soft, methodical footsteps and the echo of that terrible scream. The Wendigo was coming. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted, my lungs burning with every breath, my legs pumping with a desperation I hadn't known I was capable of. Behind me, the Wendigo was closing in, its footsteps growing louder, faster, more aggressive. I could hear its labored breathing, feel its presence bearing down on me. I was running as fast as I could, but it wasn't enough. It was gaining on me. My heart pounded harder than ever, fear coursing through my veins like fire. I could see the moonlight ahead, the trail narrowing as it bent through the trees. My truck was still too far, but I had no choice. I had to keep going. Every second counted. Then I heard it right behind me. Too close. In a moment of pure survival instinct, I spun around, knife in hand, and lunged at the creature. I drove the blade deep into its chest, the point sinking into its pale, skeletal flesh. The Wendigo let out a high-pitched wail of pain, its eyes glowing brighter as it screeched, but my attack barely slowed it down. With one powerful swipe of its long, emaciated arm, it knocked me clean off my feet. I flew through the air, my body tumbling uncontrollably. It felt like I was airborne forever, crashing through the snow and leaves before skidding to a painful stop. I must have flown at least 30 feet, the wind completely knocked out of me. Dazed, I struggled to move, gasping for air, my chest heaving as I tried to regain control. I looked up, my knife still embedded in the creature's chest, but it barely seemed to notice. It stood there, its grotesque form towering over the snow, blood oozing slowly from the wound as it locked its cold, glowing eyes on me. It began walking toward me, slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. The way it moved was horrifying, its steps almost unnatural, its hunger palpable. I tried to push myself up, but before I could, the creature let out another deafening roar. The sound tore through the night, a high-pitched screech that pierced my ears and rattled my brain. It was unbearable. The sheer volume of it sent me to my knees, hands clamped over my ears as I cried out in pain, trying to block it out. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and the world spun around me. I could feel the Wendigo's rage, its hatred, in that scream, and it was driving me to the brink of madness. I was helpless, vulnerable, and the Wendigo was closing in. As I knelt there, ears ringing from the creature's horrific screech, a thought broke through the haze of pain. My flare gun. I had always packed it for emergencies, a last resort. This was beyond any emergency I'd ever imagined. The Wendigo was closing in, its twisted form looming over me, ready to strike again. Desperately, I scrambled for my bag, fingers shaking as I fumbled with the zipper. The creature's footsteps were heavy, growing closer with each agonizing second. Finally, I grabbed hold of the flare gun, yanking it free. My heart raced as I cocked the hammer back, my vision still swimming as I raised the flare gun with trembling hands. The Wendigo's glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel its malice, its hunger bearing down on me. Without hesitation, I pulled the trigger. The flare shot out with a blinding flash, filling the night with a brilliant red-orange glow. The world around me lit up in an instant, every tree, every snow-covered branch illuminated in the harsh, fiery light. The flare struck the creature square in the chest, embedding itself next to my knife. For a split second, the Wendigo stood frozen, its skeletal form outlined in the intense light. Then it screeched again, an ear-piercing, guttural wail that shook the very ground beneath me. The flare burned fiercely, sending plumes of smoke curling up from its chest as the creature thrashed in agony. Its movements became frantic, wild, as it staggered backward, clawing at the burning flare lodged in its flesh. I watched, breathless, as the Wendigo turned and bolted into the forest, retreating into the dark wilderness from where it had come. The fiery glow of the flare flickered through the trees as the creature vanished into the night, my knife still embedded in its chest. Its howls echoed in the distance, growing fainter and fainter until finally there was nothing. I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The creature had retreated into the forest, but I couldn't waste a second. Pain shot through my body with every step as I forced myself to run. My lungs burned, and my ribs throbbed from the impact of the Wendigo's earlier strike, but the adrenaline kept me moving. The woods blurred around me as I sprinted toward my truck, each breath sharp and ragged in the freezing air. I burst out onto the trail, barely keeping my footing on the icy ground. My truck was just ahead, its shape almost surreal in the moonlight. I stumbled toward it, wrenching the door open and collapsing into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, and when I turned the ignition, the engine sputtered and groaned, refusing to catch. Come on, come on, I muttered, panic rising in my chest. My heart pounded in my ears as I glanced frantically at the surrounding forest, half expecting the Wendigo to burst from the trees at any second. Finally, with a rough cough, the engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into drive, but just as I pressed the gas, I heard something, the same sickening screech from before. I whipped my head around, and my blood ran cold. The Wendigo was right outside my window. Before I could react, its bony hand smashed through the glass, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The freezing night air rushed in as its claws raked across my face. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a burning sting that cut deep into my skin. It was like its touch carried fire, searing my flesh. I screamed in agonizing pain. For a moment, I thought it had me, its long fingers digging into my flesh, but I hit the gas, the tires spinning in the snow, before catching. The truck lurched forward, and I felt the Wendigo's grip slip as it tumbled away from the window, screeching as I sped down the icy road. The cold air howled through the broken window, biting into my skin like needles, but I kept my foot down on the accelerator. My breath came out in desperate, ragged gasps, my face throbbing from the Wendigo's attack. I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw it, a tall, dark silhouette, its glowing eyes locked onto me as it gave chase, its form unnatural and terrifying in the moonlight. It was fast, too fast, but as I pushed the truck harder, I could see the distance between us grow. Slowly, inch by inch, the Wendigo faded into the dark, its silhouette disappearing into the snowy wilderness. But I didn't slow down, not until I knew I was miles away. For weeks after that night, sleep had been elusive. Even when exhaustion finally pulled me under, the nightmares always dragged me back into the cold, haunted wilderness. My ribs, fractured from the creature's vicious strike, ached constantly. I hadn't even realized how badly I'd been hurt until I made it home. The adrenaline, the need to survive, it had all numbed the pain until I collapsed in my driveway. Now my body bore the scars of that encounter. 3 long, jagged lines across my face, a permanent reminder of the Wendigo's claws. Every time I looked in the mirror, I was forced to relive that night, the night I came face to face with a legend. People had asked about the scars, and I always gave them the same answer: a bear attack. It was easier that way, easier than trying to explain what had really happened. Who would believe me? Tonight, though, the warmth of my home did little to soothe my nerves. Even surrounded by safety, I couldn't shake the lingering dread. It clung to me, a constant shadow, always waiting. Then it came, a sound in the dead of night, cutting through the silence with chilling clarity. A loud, screeching wail, unnatural, piercing. I shot up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was distant, but unmistakable. It was the same wail that had shattered the night in Algonquin. My heart raced as I sat there, listening. The creature, whatever it was, it had found me. The Wendigo was still out there. Second story. There's something in the deep woods of northern Sweden. I went to a garage sale in my local town a few days ago. I live in Sweden, and so second-hand shops and car boot sales are very common, at least out in the countryside. Often I just end up browsing the stalls without really intending to buy anything. The one I visited a few days ago was in a village about a half-hour's drive from where I live. The second-hand store was just literally one room packed with all sorts of riffraff that should have been thrown away ages ago, rather than being sold for far more than it was worth. On my way out, something caught my eyes that I couldn't resist taking a closer look at. It was a history book about the local area, and because I'd recently moved here for work, I got curious and decided to buy it. Inside were a few loose papers with handwritten notes which took some time to decipher due to the fading of the ink. I don't know who it belongs to, or if the story on the pages was even true, but I thought maybe you guys would be interested in hearing about it. Before I begin, I need to be honest with you. You see, the thing is that this story isn't mine to share, but I feel like I have to. I've spent too many years feeling guilt pressing against my chest, and if I don't tell you now, it'll go with me to my grave, and I'd like to leave this life with a clear conscience. Another thing you need to know is that I've changed some details, such as the names of those involved, and place names just to allow them some privacy. I apologize if I seem a little cryptic, and I don't mean to sound like one of those conspiracy theorists, but you'll understand. I promise. Some of you reading this might have kids of your own, or maybe you're still deciding whether or not parenthood is for you. I just want to tell you this. I am so sorry. Anyway, I guess I should start at the beginning. My name is unimportant, but to make it easier for you, let's just call me Edwin. Ever since I was a kid, I loved making up stories. By the time I started school and learned to write, it was almost impossible to make me stop. Back then there were no smartphones, computers, or iPads, or what have you. The only thing we had was good old pen and paper. Soon enough, Swedish became the subject I excelled in, and my grades were always high. One of my teachers used to say that I'd been born with the gift of words. I could look around me and transform my surroundings into fantastical adventures. It was a way for me to cope with the repetitiveness and mundane nature of daily life. To that end, I feel it's important for you to understand that I've never been a city person, and I'm not the only one. You see, my family come from northern Sweden, an area known locally as Tornedalen. When I say north, I mean way above the Arctic Circle in the middle of literal nowhere, surrounded by forests and mountains. My old man grew up in a minuscule village in the northernmost part of Tornedalen, on either side of the rippling waters of Torna River and an hour's drive from Kiruna. Dad grew up in a small homestead with 4 older brothers and my late grandmother, who to this day is the kindest woman I've ever known. I never met my grandfather as he passed away when Dad was 16 years old, and so my grandmother was forced to raise 5 boys all alone while running a small grocery store. There wasn't much Grandma couldn't handle, and God help anyone who dared challenge her. During the first few years of my life, I lived in that homestead with my family. I attended school in the local village and liked it well enough. If you've never lived in the countryside, it's almost impossible to convey the freedom of living so far away from the city. Summer months were spent exploring every single path, stream, or hunting cabin with my friends. The eternal light from the midnight sun turned the whole world into our playground, and we stayed awake until we simply were too tired to keep our eyes open. In those days, parents didn't care as much about their kids' whereabouts, so long as you were home for supper. During the winter months, we used snowshoes to get around in the woods, which were now covered by a thick blanket of white powdery snow. If you were lucky, and if it was cold enough, you might catch a glimpse of the green shimmer from the northern light dancing on the sky. I remember my grandmother once telling me that according to folklore, people believed the lights were souls dancing on their way to the afterlife. At some point in the 60s, Dad and I moved to Stockholm where there were better job opportunities. We both missed living in the north, and so every school holiday was spent in the small village by the river. We spent those holidays fishing, both ice and normal finishing, hiking trips, and overnight stays in old hunting cabins. Some of my fondest memories from those days were when we followed old ski tracks, placed reindeer skins on the snow, and then lay there for hours enjoying the warm sunlight of early spring. We often sat in comfortable silence, without feeling the need to say much, but sometimes just as the first colors of twilight appeared, Dad would tell me ghost stories, even though I was way too young. Summer holidays seemed endless, and I often explored every single corner of the village with my old friends. Sometimes we'd set up tents in some secluded meadow and retell those ghost stories first shared by our parents. I wish I could tell you that I continued visiting the village in my teenage years, but with all the things brought on puberty, and when I eventually started university the year I turned 19, I'd almost forgotten all about the little village up north. When it comes to my mom, there's not much to say. She's never been a part of my life, and I learned early on that there was no point asking questions about her. My only memory of her is a vague scent of lavender which she used as perfume. If I'm completely honest, I'm not even sure I know her name. That's probably why Dad sounded so surprised when I offered to travel up for Easter during my second year at university. Even now, I'm not sure why I was so keen to go, but when I heard that my uncle hadn't been seen for a few days, I just knew something was wrong. Dad couldn't go because he was tied up with work, and none of the other brothers had a particularly great relationship with my uncle because they thought he was a little more eccentric than what was socially acceptable. In their defense, they weren't wrong, but they also rarely spoke about him, and just like with my mom, I learned to simply not ask questions. Uncle H was Dad's oldest brother who a few years ago decided to move back to their childhood home. He'd grown tired of city life and missed the tranquility and silence of the far north. Dad always said that when you get older, you get this yearning to go back to your roots. Honestly, I can't remember a single Saturday morning when Uncle H didn't phone us to talk about the latest gossip in the village. Now, before I continue, I feel like I have to explain what winter is like in the north, because I honestly don't think you can understand it unless you've experienced it yourself. Imagine waking up in the morning and it's so eerily silent that not even the birds who sometimes stay over winter are awake. It is so bone-crushingly cold that when it hits you, it's as if thousands of sharp needles are piercing into your skin all at once. Not only can you see your breath, you can practically touch. Then there's sun, which doesn't rise until late in the day and only stays up for a couple of hours before making its all-too-quick descent behind the horizon. I began my journey on the day before Maundy Thursday, when I flew from my small university town to the north, where I met up with one of my childhood friends whose car I was borrowing to drive to the village. The moment I stepped in through the front door with its familiar squeaky hinges, my childhood memories instantly came flooding back. I could almost smell Gran's freshly baked breath and warm laughter echoing through the hallway. 2 empty coffee cups stood on the kitchen table and a half-eaten cinnamon bun, which is practically societal heresy in Sweden. Other than some dried reindeer meat, a loaf of bread, and a half a liter of milk, the fridge was depressingly empty. Maybe Uncle H was in a rush somewhere and hadn't been able to buy groceries. It was still strange and not like him to tell anyone where he was headed. At that point, I realized it was both too late and too dark to go out and look for Uncle H. Not to mention nights were even more freezing than during the day, and to be completely honest, I had no idea where to begin my search. Besides, if I spent the next few days with the house as my base of operations, my first priority was to make sure I didn't freeze to death inside. I spent most of that evening cranking up the heat in the fireplace and making myself comfortable in the lounge. City life, I realized, had spoiled me with its modernities like electric heating, and the simplicity of life above the Arctic Circle was almost forgotten to me. Even though the house was a more than familiar part of my life, I still felt like a stranger here. An eerie feeling lingered in the air that I couldn't quite describe. The closest thing I can think of is that it felt as though I was trespassing. Maybe it was the general fatigue of the journey here, or my worry over Uncle H's disappearance catching up to me. To silence my worrying mind, I decided to plan what tomorrow would look like. Many of the families from my childhood still lived in the village, and I thought that perhaps one of them had seen my uncle over the past few days. An angry and hungry growl came from my stomach, and I quickly made a sandwich with smoked sausage, which I devoured with a glass of cold milk. I thanked my past self for packing an extra duvet in the car, because I was convinced that whatever bedding remained in the old wardrobes were covered in damp and likely partially eaten by moth larvae, burying themselves into the fabric. Nevertheless, I made myself comfortable in the old sofa bed and finally began to feel more at peace as I stared into the fire, feeling myself being hypnotized by the hot, glowing embers and dancing flames. Just before my eyelids became too heavy to stay open, I thought I heard a vague, buzzing sound just outside, almost as if there were voices creating a melody traveling with the wind. Asterisk, asterisk. I was awoken at 4 o'clock in the morning by the deafening bell of the grandfather clock in the kitchen. Cursing myself for forgetting its loudness, I decided there was no point in going back to sleep, so I made myself a cup of coffee and flicked through an old local newspaper. I'm not sure what made me look out the window, but I almost choked on the coffee when I saw a crouching silhouette on the edge of the forest, trudging through the snow towards the house. My heart began to race when I realized that I had nothing to defend myself with, and if I did, what was I going to do? It was only when the figure got closer to the house I recognized the more distinct features of the shape. It was my uncle. Without even putting on my shoes, I ran out to him. He was limping as though he had been injured, but he still carried a rifle in one hand, but his jacket was covered in blood. Even though he looked right at me, the look in his eyes was still distant. What the hell happened? I asked, but my uncle only muttered something in Finnish that I couldn't understand. There was no need for a doctor to tell me that he was in shock. Come on, I said to him, let's go inside. What the hell, boy? He cursed. What are you doing up here? Don't tell me your father sent you. I explained that when nobody had heard from him, Dad got worried and I offered to come up here. As soon as we got inside, I lit the stove to make more coffee and then recalled seeing half a bottle of vodka in the pantry, which I put on the table along with glass next to it, but my uncle drank directly from the bottle. A few moments later, I poured 2 cups of strong, black coffee, and for a while we just sat there in silence. I wondered if I should call an ambulance, but then my uncle told me what happened to me. Uncle H explained that he'd been visiting a relative on the other side of the river, and, as per usual, it got a little later than planned. At some point in the middle of the night, he decided to make his way home through the woods like he so often did. Snowshoes made it easy to make his way across the massive amounts of snow covering the ground, and whatever alcohol remained in his system kept him warm. Even though my uncle had trekked through those woods ever since he was a little boy, a strong feeling of unease crept up his back and made the hairs stand on the back of his neck. By the light of the moon, he thought there were shadows moving towards him, accompanied by a strange buzzing sound in the wind. Then he saw them. Dozens, if not hundreds of children whose faces were unnaturally pale and their eyes were entirely hollow. The creatures dragged themselves up from the snow and made the most unnatural sound my uncle had ever heard. It was deafening and heartbreaking all at the same time, and he was overcome by emotions that he could not name. A bony hand grabbed his ankle, and another opened the mouth, which turned in a massive, gaping black hole. My uncle told me that he'd never run so fast in his life. Asterisk, asterisk. Uncle H didn't say much the next day. Mostly, he just wondered how long I was planning to stay, and when I told him I'd be around for a few days, he seemed pleased that he wouldn't be alone over Easter. However, when I told him that I was going to call my dad to let him know everything was all right, my uncle made me swear to not recount what he'd told me. He said that it was probably for the better if it stayed between us, seeing as the rest of our family already thought of him as a little strange. I gave him my word, and so, when Dad wondered what happened, I simply told him that my uncle got lost in the forest on his way home. Dad muttered something about stubborn old men, but didn't ask any more questions. After I hung up, I turned to my uncle who sat by the kitchen table and stared out the window. My mouth hung open as I struggled to form the words, even though the questions were clear in my mind. "I know you don't believe me, boy," my uncle said, as if he'd read my mind. "But surely you've heard the stories? Those about people who get lost in the woods and never make it back because they've been taken by the miling." I wish I understood what he meant, but then a vague memory resurfaced somewhere in the back of my mind. Uncle H nodded at the chair, and I sat down, nervous about what I was going to hear. A part of me didn't want to dismiss his experience, but I didn't believe in ghosts and ghouls. Then, he told me something that to this day, I wish I'd never heard. Asterisk, asterisk. When Uncle H, Dad, and their brothers were younger, they often traveled to the neighboring village on Saturdays to attend barn dances. Sometimes, girls from larger cities would attend the dances, and if you were lucky, you might get a dance, a phone number, and a promise to meet again. That's where Dad saw her for the first time. Uncle H said that if there was ever a moment where he believed in love at first sight, that was it. He recalled exactly how the look in Dad's eyes changed, and when my uncle followed Dad's gaze, he noticed a girl he'd never seen there before. Her long, blonde, and curly hair glimmered in the light, and she wore a green, knee-length dress. Uncle H thought she might have been there with some friends, but she was standing away from other girls as if she was avoiding them. After a while, Dad eventually plucked up the courage to speak with her, and when they danced, he was enchanted. Afterwards, everything happened so quickly, and the only thing Dad would talk about was his new love. Uncle H explained that he and the other brothers just assumed it was yet another crush that would fade like it always did, but this time they were wrong. Uncle H told me that my mother loved my father as much as he loved her, but she was carrying a terrible secret. In small communities like the ones up north, rumor spreads like wildfire. Keeping anything to yourself is pretty much impossible, and my mom knew she didn't have much time. Being pregnant with a child that wasn't my dad's and that was born in secret could make life incredibly difficult for a family. My dad would have struggled to find decent work with which he could support his new family. So, after the birth of my half-sibling, my mom knew what she had to do. It's not difficult to hike into the forest and bury a child so that nobody finds out about it. Women in these parts have been doing that for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Who knows how many unloved and illegitimate children are buried in the woods of the North. On the surface, my parents had a happy marriage, and a year after their wedding, I was born. According to my uncle, Dad had never been as happy as the first time he held me in his arms, just as enchanted as the first time he saw my mom. There was never any doubt that my mom loved me with her whole heart, But Uncle H also knew that she still carried with her the grief of burying her first child. You could see it in her eyes and how she sometimes stared out the window into the forest. One late winter's night, she never came home. My dad was hysterical and looked everywhere without any results. The whole village made a joint effort to find her, and after a few hours, a body was found in the woods. The strange thing was, instead of being frozen, it was almost completely charcoaled, as if it had been devoured by an unnatural fire. The worst part of it all, though, was the shape of what once had been a child in the body's arms. My dad never spoke about what happened. He never met another woman. Even though Uncle H and the others told him to move on with his life, get married again, and give me a chance to grow up with a mother. Dad refused and moved far away from the village in the north, to cities of the south where he could hide his grief in the exhaust fumes and sweat from the ever-growing masses of the city. Far, far away from the woods of the north. Asterisk, asterisk. I'm writing this down out of pure selfishness and to ease the burden that's been weighing on my heart for years. Most of you won't believe me, and that's fair enough, I suppose. My cousins remain blissfully ignorant of our family's secret. These days, they have kids and even grandkids. Sometimes, just like I did when I was younger, they spend school holidays in the village in the north. I can't help but wonder if sometimes they might have heard that same melodic buzzing in the wind just before going to bed at night. Third story. Don't whistle when it's dark out. While growing up, my family wasn't fortunate. To put it bluntly, we were quite poor. Because of that, entertaining myself as a kid was frequently a very tedious job, and I had to get creative with it. Most of the time I spent outside, where we had a great big yard and the nearest neighbors were 2 miles down a main road. On cold days, my mother would make me stay inside, and I had to resort to the only thing in the house that could entertain a 9-year-old, the family radio. I absolutely loved listening to music on that thing, and I often caught myself whistling along to my favorite tunes while staring out the kitchen window. On one of these occasions, while I was whistling an old Elvis classic, staring out to the cold October afternoon, I remember my mother coming into the kitchen and looking at me with annoyance while she was preparing to go into town. "You know, it's going to be dark soon, so you better stop your whistling," said my mom while turning down the radio's volume. "What do you mean?" I remember being confused about that since I've never heard my mother say that before. "You really shouldn't whistle when it's dark out," continued my mother. "It's how you call the dead." "The dead?" I asked, confused. "Yes, demons, ghosts, zombies, and ghouls. All that is dead will rise and come for you if they hear someone whistling at night." I thought about it for a second, then turned up the volume again. Of course she was making that up. Even I was old enough to know that ghosts aren't real. That was what my dad told me when I was scared of my closet anyway. And besides, she was just saying that to hush me down. I heard my mom making a comment on the loud music, then saying she'll go into town to buy some sugar for tomorrow's coffee. I heard the door close and looked at the clock, 6:35 in the afternoon. One more hour till my dad comes home. I had the house to myself. The gray sky was beginning to turn into a dark void as the night fell over the horizon. I was still staring out the kitchen window and listening to music when one of my favorite songs came on. I don't remember which song exactly it was, but boy, I was crazy over it. Losing myself in the tune, I began to whistle along while dancing across the kitchen, treating it like a dance floor. My mother's advice popped up in my head for a second, but quickly disappeared as the chorus started. When the song ended, I sat down on a chair, breathing heavily in exhaustion from my sick dance moves. As I was filling myself a glass of water from the tap, I quickly glanced out the window, which was now almost completely dark, as only the cloudy sky provided some illumination to the house backyard, which went all the way to the forest. I noticed something in the distance, just barely visible at the start of the forest trees. Looking closely, I managed to see that it was actually 2 shapes standing next to each other, about 50 meters from the house. They were both human-looking, although it was hard to tell, as they were almost blended with the dark forest background. I decided that maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, and since I needed a pee, I stopped the radio and went upstairs to the bathroom. When I returned to the kitchen, I looked out the window again, and that's when the adrenaline hit me in the stomach as I began to back away from the glass. One of the shapes was gone, and the other had moved much closer than when I saw originally. From the 2 seconds I spent looking at the shape, I had noticed that it was definitely human, or at least humanesque. It was bald, and its eyes were closed, and yet I felt as it was staring right at me. I panicked and quickly ran upstairs. As I was running, I heard it tapping on the kitchen window. I went into my room and hid under the covers, trying to make sense of what I saw. I could still barely hear the tapping on the glass from downstairs, and it wasn't stopping. On the contrary, it was getting louder. I had never experienced such fear in my life, and I noticed that I'd started crying, but was concentrated on fear and didn't notice until right then. I must have stayed under the covers for 20 minutes, when finally the tapping stopped. I heard an engine outside and immediately sighed with relief. It was my dad coming back from work. I told him about what I saw, and he grabbed his gun and a flashlight to investigate. He found some footsteps at the edge of the forest, but nothing close to the house. Since then, I refused to be left alone during nighttime and absolutely never whistled again. And ever since that day, I constantly feel that someone is watching me at night, silently, just waiting for me to make the same mistake again. Fourth story. A group of campers went missing in Alaska. I was sent to investigate. If you were to name a monster, I've most likely hunted it. I take assignments that send me all over the world, and I get paid quite handsomely for my work. Monster hunters in my league are few and far between, and I wouldn't recommend calling one of us in for something like a skinwalker, as those are below my pay grade. Occasionally, though, I'll pick up one of those jobs if work is slow. Unlike many of my fellow hunters, I'm not affiliated with any organization. I'm more like a private contractor, a private Grim Reaper, if you will. Eventually, I became good enough at my job that my colleagues started to actually call me Reaper, but you guys can call me Lance. It really doesn't make any difference to me. Nicknames don't carry any sort of weight with me. I just consider myself lucky to come back alive after each hunt. Now for the story. I can guarantee that's why you're all here. This is my most recent hunt, and is also my closest brush with death. It started like any other day. I woke up, went through my morning routine, and received the call while I was eating some bacon and eggs out at a local restaurant. The call was your typical missing persons case. A group of 4 campers had gone out into the Alaskan wilderness and planned on being gone for a week. When they didn't come back 2 days after they were supposed to, the authorities were called in to search the area. They haven't reported back since last night, and with Wendigo season about to be in full swing, I had an idea of what may have happened. Since work had been slow lately, I gladly accepted the job. I wouldn't need anything more than what I brought for most of my hunts, except winter gear, but I always like to be over-prepared. My usual gear included heavy-duty gloves, a monkswood plant, a crossbow with 12 bolts, a 9mm pistol fully loaded with silver-tipped rounds, and 2 extra clips along with some basic rations. This time, however, I will be taking my flamethrower along for the trip, as Wendigos and most creatures in general don't care for fire. As for the monkswood and silver-tipped rounds, both the monkswood's poison and silver were lethal to anything I hunted. Something you may not know is that Wendigos tend to behave differently depending on where they live. In the lower 48, they're usually solitary, using their ability to mimic human vocals to lure their prey in. In Alaska and Canada, they completely change up their hunting tactics. What they do in these regions to the north is typically travel in groups of at least 4 or 5 and rush their prey. Whatever the reason, they are far more aggressive in these areas, and I advise you to not visit their territory from mid-October to mid-March. I felt the cold, autumn breeze rustling my hair as soon as I arrived in Anchorage. The man who put in the call was waiting for me at the airport to talk in more depth about what happened. His heavy Russian accent made him hard to understand, but I got the gist of what he wanted to inform me about. The poor soul was worried to death of what may have befallen his daughter and her friends. Where things became interesting is when he told me that he didn't believe it was a Wendigo that had gotten to the campers. I asked what he thought it was, but in his words, he dare not speak its name. I won't lie. I was pissed. Maybe this poor old bastard had some meaningful information that could help me, but now I had nothing more to go on than before. A normal hunter would have decided to turn back right there. I am not a normal hunter. A massive well of curiosity overflowing with speculation opened up in my mind. I wanted so deeply to know what this possible mystery horror could be. Finally, something had reignited my passion. After years upon years of hunting the same things, I could have some change, some excitement. I wished for this to be the hunt of a lifetime. I came upon the campsite at a time where I'd have about 2 or so hours of sunlight to work with, and it was necessary to move quickly. I had to walk nearly 5 miles from where I parked, feeling watched the entire time. It wouldn't be to my advantage to be stuck out in the night with a Wendigo or whatever other monstrosities stalk the night. There is only one advantage I'd have if it made it to nighttime. Surely, it would. The moon was going to be full, so my surroundings would at least be illuminated enough for me to see. If it were a new moon, even a hunter as skilled as myself would be easy pickings. Searching the campsite went as expected. It was completely derelict. Nothing in the woods around me was making a single sound. There was only pure, dead silence. Whatever came through there made a pretty damn good account of itself. Tents were ripped as if they had been through a paper shredder multiple times and were subsequently put into a blender. Droplets of blood were everywhere, staining the surrounding trees and what remained of the tents. Somehow, where the campfire had once been looked like it was used the night before I came to investigate. That meant someone around here was alive and was also smart enough to know that the fire kept the Wendigos at bay, or at least that's how it was supposed to be. A mangled body of a man littered with large gashes and bite marks lay a few feet away from the fire. At first glance, it looked like a cut and dry Wendigo killing. The claw marks were consistent with previous leftovers I've seen, but the bite marks weren't. All of the internal organs of this poor man were ripped out and eaten. Even with all of that, there was no blood from his corpse. This worried me more than anything. No monster I hunted before had ever left a corpse without blood, except vampires, and they didn't devour people's internal organs. Over by the bushes, I noticed a young woman and another man in the same state as their friend. 2 more bodies that appeared to be akin to those of park rangers again had the same wounds. They had to be the search party. I scouted some of the nearby trees, and I saw it, the body of a Wendigo that was horribly disfigured. Its emaciated frame was completely broken and its antlers shattered. I knew then I had to either leave or stay and kill this mystery demon. Against my better judgment, I enclosed myself within the campsite, using my flamethrower to create a ring of fire between myself and the tree-line. All the while, something still gnawed at the back of my mind. There were 4 campers, 3 bodies. Something didn't add up. A weak, female voice spoke from a tall tree directly behind me. You shouldn't have done that. The fire brought it here last time. I turned to see her visibly shaking. Her clothes in tatters, her blonde hair a complete mess, her blue eyes full of tears and fear. I felt sympathy for her. I had once been like her in my earlier days. It was my first ever hunt. A werewolf had run me up into an old attic, and I was ready to throw everything away. Its evil, red eyes glare is forever burned into my memory, constantly haunting my nightmares. In that moment, I stood tall and became what I am now, a hunter that shows no mercy to monsters. Never show mercy. They will not return the favor. Come up here, the girl screamed, having all of her faded life return to her in that single instant. I hesitated. Skinwalkers often deploy this tactic on sympathetic people. However, she was right. No sooner than the girl had mentioned it, I heard something barreling through the trees from my left. It was supernaturally fast. The branches snapped and the pine needles crunched. The beast's footfalls became louder and heavier as it approached. I hastily climbed the tree. It was difficult with my gear, but I couldn't afford to leave any of it behind besides my flamethrower, which I discarded for my self-preservation. Somehow, I managed to elevate myself high to a high enough branch. I guess sheer willpower, coupled with the adrenaline produced by unadulterated fear, can accomplish nearly any physical feat of strength. The girl made to scream as the behemoth burst into the clearing, but I was able to reach over and cover her mouth, albeit with some strain. In the clearing stood a massive wolf. If I had to guess, he was probably close to 7 feet tall at the shoulder. A light breeze blew through his thick, white hair. A pair of gleaming, evil, red eyes were pointed up at me from the wolf, and his face was curled into a snarl, revealing fangs dripping with a crimson-red liquid. The low-pitched, distorted howl he bellowed was beyond deafening. It was more. It was commanding and primal. The wolf paced around my ring of fire and stepped through it after one full circle. Its hair wasn't singed even in the slightest by the roaring flames. The wolf stayed until the moon had risen high in the sky, staring into my soul with its evil eyes the entire time. But once I could hear the trees rustling in the distance and the unmistakable shrieks of wendigos, the wolf left. Knowing these monsters as I did, I knew he would come back. He wanted both of us dead, but why hadn't he already killed us? Surely he had enough strength to ram the tree and knock it down, taking us with it and providing an easy meal. The beast could have leaped up with his powerful legs and kept doing so until one of us was pulled down along with him. As I tried to think of a way out of our predicament, the girl spoke to me for the first time in hours. "Why are you here?" she asked, making the defeat she felt audible. "Some Russian guy called me to find out what happened to you guys. The better question is, how did you survive?" I questioned in return. "So Natalia's dad sent you. I live because they died. That thing almost got me, too, but it snagged my jacket instead. I've been up here for 3 days." I could feel the tears well up in my eyes. Luckily, I still had my pack with me. I pulled out a piece of jerky and a water bottle and handed it to her. "Here, you need this more than I do. May I get your name?" She quickly, but gratefully snatched it and started eating and drinking. "I know it's not much, but I won't let you die. Not if I can help it." Her voice perked up a bit after having her meager sustenance. "My name's Jillian, and thank you. I thought I'd starve up here. I hate to have to do this, but what do you know about that wolf?" "It's called the Wahila. My friend John's grandpa told us about it. I'm sorry, but that's all I know." "Shit," I thought to myself, trying not to look worried, which I could tell wasn't working due to Jillian becoming more worried herself. Every other hunter that had been sent after a Wahila never came back. These are the top of the game in North America. No matter how long it takes, they always kill something they set their sights on, and now we were likely its next form of food when it came back. At that time, not a single person had ever documented its abilities. There was only speculation as to what it could do. I've seen firsthand what it leaves behind, and unless you have a death wish, never go after the Wahila. "What's wrong?" she asked, wanting to know what someone like me could possibly be afraid of. "It's nothing," I lied to no avail. "You might as well tell me. We either leave alive, or we die," she declared with that same fire I used to have in my early days. "All right, I'll tell you, but you won't like it. I'm one of the top monster hunters out there. People pay a pretty penny for guys like me to do this stuff, and as good as I am, as good as other hunters like me are, none of us have ever come back from hunting the Wahila." Strangely, this didn't faze her optimism. Her will to live burned brighter than the still raging ring of fire below. That lit a new fire in me. I had to get us out of here alive. "Who said you wouldn't be the first?" Jillian said, reaffirming my newfound resolve. God, she reminded me so much of the woman I began my hunting career for. When I was 19, we went out camping together in the Appalachians, just the two of us. A skinwalker took her from me, and I vowed to avenge her. I know it's like some overdone movie cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. We as humans have the drive to get revenge for our comrades and loved ones. That skinwalker ended up being the second demon I killed after that werewolf. It was like a rite of passage. Killing that bastard, though, I knew there was no going back after having done it. Here I was 7 years later, watching someone go through what I did. Maybe, in a way, my girl did come back to me. You know, maybe you're right. I agreed with her, much to her delight. Now, I was determined more than ever to come back alive. I opened one of the pockets on my pack and put on my gloves. Then, I opened a second pocket and carefully removed the monkswood plant. Using what was left of the water, I distilled it, as the wahila can smell even the faintest scent of it. I tipped my crossbow bolts with my concoction and waited. There would only be time for one shot before the massive wolf knew what we were trying to do if it didn't already. I turned to Jillian and told her, handing her my 9mm, "Be quiet no matter what you see or hear. If something happens to me, I need you to run. Just make it out of the forest. I can buy you enough time for that." She nodded in compliance. It warmed my heart knowing at least one of us would survive the night, although I didn't want to die myself. What felt like another 2 or so hours passed. The fire had long since burned itself out, and the sun was rising. Then we heard it. A Wendigo was making its way towards our clearing. From its frantic-sounding movements, the wahila was dead on its trail. As soon as the Wendigo broke the treeline, it would be over. Sure enough, the wahila pounced on it just as predicted. This was my chance. I shot my crossbow. Direct hit. The bolt lodged itself between the massive wolf's shoulder blades as it eviscerated its prey. Its howl echoed throughout the forest, making it sound as if the forest itself was in pain. The potent poison would need a few minutes to work its way throughout the wahila's massive body as it scampered away. The Wendigo was still alive, letting out its loud shrieks of anguish as it crawled to the base of our tree and began climbing. Before I could reload my crossbow, I heard the crack of a gunshot. Between the demon's eyes was a smoking hole. It no longer moved, save for a couple twitches. Jillian and I climbed down the tree and sprinted in the direction of the trailhead. The feeling of being watched was following us the entire way until we reached the last clearing before the beginning of the trail. The menacing presence that had been stalking us was standing in the center of the clearing. Stumbling towards us was the wahila, crossbow bolt still wedged in its back. It was clearly succumbing to the poison, but even that wouldn't stop this hellhound from its endeavor to murder us. Jillian froze. I wrenched the pistol from her firm grip as the monster charged us, teeth bared, red eyes glaring, and mouth frothing. One shot was all it took. It was over. The wahila's body seized up, and it dropped to the ground with a resounding, satisfying thud. We made it to the truck I pulled up in the day prior. I radioed someone nearby and told them about what they had to retrieve from the forest. At first, they sounded skeptical. This wasn't the person intended to receive the message, but after some fumbling with the radio on the other end, we were given the green light to leave the area. I don't know if it was my imagination or not, but I swear I saw a pair of red eyes watching us leave. Fifth story. I saw something in the woods of Nova Scotia, Canada. I need to know what it was. This is a story I haven't really told anyone. Geez, if it weren't for my best friend being present when it happened, I probably would have gaslit myself into believing it was a nightmare or I was just going plain nuts. It's one of those memories that, no matter how much time goes by, you never forget. The details don't get muddy for even a moment. It was 2012, my freshman year of high school. I was 15 years old and had been in the company of my best friend that night. Let's call her Marie. We lived in a fairly small town on the eastern coast of Canada, Nova Scotia to be exact. It was an old mining community sat in the middle of the woods. To paint a picture for you, there wasn't really much to do. Our economy had tanked many moons before the rest of the country, so outside of hard drugs or crime, all you really had to do was walk around. Marie and I just so happened to have made walking a bit of a natural pastime. We'd properly mapped out that entire town and its surrounding hills and forests in rain, shine, sleet, or snow. We'd seen everything our little community had to offer from its vast range of wildlife, to its colorful selection of junkies. Please, keep these tidbits in mind before you tell me what we saw was an animal or a human. It was an autumn night, with nothing more for two high school girls to do, and homework not being something we specialized in. We decided to go on one of our many town walks. This night in particular had us go a little off the beaten trail. You see, typically we'd have stuck to the main roads, probably ended up at a Tim Hortons before calling it a night and heading back home, but not tonight. Tonight we decided to walk by the food bank. You might be wondering what the draw of an old food bank is. You see, it wasn't just a food bank. Back when we were still a mining town, our food bank was a train station. Trains would come by and pick up coal that was freshly dug from the coal mines and take it all across the country. The old train yard was still there, its now rust-covered cars acting as mock tombs to a much more prosperous era gone by. We'd frequented the train yard with our friends in the past, climbing the cars, sneaking inside among other things that could have gotten kids hurt. So it wasn't a new place to us at all, and we thought that since it was at the tree line, tucked away in a quiet enough part of town that we could freely walk and chat without the concern of traffic or the like. Sidewalks weren't very frequent on that side of town. The sun had already set as we made our way down the long stretch of road, that October chill grasping at our small frames like glue, while the all-too-familiar autumn smell of still dying plant life had permeated the air. We were talking to each other about what teenage girls typically babble about. Boys, Facebook, real important stuff. We had been so caught up in our conversation of the most dire importance that by the time we had made it to the fence that lined the train yard, it genuinely took us a moment to notice the noise. It was a very clear scream. We stopped dead in our tracks and began to stare at each other, not so much out of fear, but bewilderment. It didn't quite sound like an animal, but it definitely didn't sound human either. I've gotten up close and personal with enough cougars, wolves and toddlers to know that this screaming we were hearing was caught somewhere in between man and beast. We stood there, glaring into each other's eyes for a few more seconds before finally turning our attention towards the sound. It was dark, mind you, not pitch black as there were some street lights around though few and far between, but we couldn't see anything. To us from where we were standing, it was just an old train station turned food bank, a rusted-out fence, and a couple of unused and falling-apart train cars. The screams didn't subside as we were now staring into the foreground of what became a series of mental photographs of the area. It was then I realized that just up ahead, the third and final train car sat partially covered from our viewpoint by a few bushes. I had turned my head to Marie, a mischievous grin donning my face like a cowl. "Last one to the train car has to buy the French vanillas," I exclaimed before quickly jogging along the side of the fence toward the final car. I heard Marie call out, "Hey, wait up," as my feet clearly were acting before my brain. I mean, gosh, this could have been some wild animal or really anything, and I was just running in a blind. I'm not particularly a brave person, and I'm honestly not sure why I did this or anything else that happened from here on out. I rounded the fence, the screaming getting louder and louder as I strode closer and closer. My heart began to race with both anxiety and sheer excitement. I wasn't sure what I was even getting myself into or what I was expecting to see at all. Needless to say, about a second later, the ever-increasing beating from my chest had come to a standstill as my heart had made itself a new home in my throat. I stopped so quickly Marie had slammed right into the back of me, but I was so frozen in fear at what I was now looking at that I barely even budged, the screaming still echoing off of the forest so loudly I could barely hear the faint whisper of an "oh my God" escape Marie's lips. No more than about 20 feet away from us, crouched just under the train car, was a pale, hairless, and naked person. It was just sitting there under the front of the car, screaming into the darkness of the autumn night. Each time it screamed, its arms would leer forward from under the car. They extended out to an unnatural length, almost like two tree branches. We both stood there, frozen in a mixture of fear and confusion. What were they doing? Were they hurt? On drugs? A million questions had begun to race through my head, and one look at Marie's face had told me the same questions were racking her mind as well. We must have stood there just watching in complete awe for what felt like 5 minutes, but realistically, it couldn't have been more than a few seconds, maybe a minute at the most. That's when, in my infinite wisdom, I decided to take a few steps closer. I took my first shaky step towards it. I felt Marie's hand grasp my arm, as if to say, "Don't," but it was clear that her fear outweighed her functionality as I easily broke from her grip just by continuing forward. I had closed about 5 or so feet of distance before stopping. I continued to stare at it from my position for another moment before clearing my throat and stammering the words, "Hey, are you okay?" The second I said those words, any thought of this being a person in need of help had flown out the window and dissipated in the cool nighttime air. Almost as if someone had hit stop on a recording, the screaming it had been happy to emit had ceased, and then it was staring at us. You need to understand, it didn't seem to even move its head. It was just 1 second staring forward into the night, and the next right back toward us. A faint growl began to seep into the area now, from where it was positioned, as I took in the details of its face in which I had become sure it wasn't human. It had a mouth that seemed to take up the width of most of its face, like a thin crack in a slab of concrete. Its eyes were small, but almost glowed in through the darkness with the most piercing yellow I have ever seen. After it had taken its time to mimic our staring back at us, its crack-like mouth had almost cartoonishly curled into a smiling man-like grin, its lips parting to reveal its long, jagged, and razor-like teeth. The beast and I continued locked into this war of attrition, though it was admittedly clearly more confident in being the dominant one in the exchange of looks. It broke the stare down after another moment, bringing its long, twiggy arms up from under the train car. It wrapped its fingers around the lip of the car and, at a near breakneck speed, kicked itself out from under the train car with a swing, almost like a chimpanzee leaping from one tree branch to another before landing and planting itself on the ground in a pose akin to that of a frog. It continued to its gaze, which now had begun to feel as though I was being sized up. My whole body had been shaking at what was akin to Mach 5. I tried to avert my eyes, look anywhere else, as it felt like any moment I would pass out in sheer terror, but I was drawn in. It felt almost like it had me in some sort of trance. I watched as it slowly began to stand, unfurling itself from the position it was in. It just seemed to get taller and taller until what I was looking at was at its full stance. Its entire body a pasty gray. Its arms had drooped down well past its knees, and its legs hooked in the back near the calf, almost like a goat. The words "I'm not religious in the slightest," though I was raised Catholic in my younger years, and the only words I could think to muster were "Hail Mary, full of grace," as I began to pray and stared down what I was sure was my end. The creature then leered itself forward, throwing its arms back as its jaw unhinged itself from its skull and dropped down to about its collarbones as it let out one final shriek, the noise embedding itself in my brain and making sure not to ever leave, to forever haunt my nightmares along with the image. I closed my eyes so tight my head began to hurt. I could feel tears streaming down my cheeks with my lips pierced close so tightly that not even a breath could escape them, and then nothing. Silence. Deafening silence. Was it over? That quickly? Was I dead? I slowly opened one eye, peeking out. I saw it. A final look. It had retaken its crouching position, giving us its final glance as well before it turned its back to us. An encounter that had felt like it lasted hours had then swiftly ended in that of a few mere seconds as the creature leapt from its position to the tree-line, and then one final leap into the woods. Just like that, it had vanished. I had almost all but forgotten Marie was there until the softness of her voice had brought me back to earth with a "Kinsey, what was?" I turned to her. Her skin had gone sheet white, and her eyes were red with tears. My legs had finally given out from the sheer exhaustion of it all as I had fallen to my knees, Marie quickly running over and catching me in an embrace as we silently wept. I'm not sure too much of what happened after that. It's all a blur, really. I told some people at first, but they were quick to laugh me off as a liar or that I was simply being over-imaginative, with Marie moving away about a year later and my only witness having gone. That didn't help my credibility. It's been 10 years since then. I no longer live in Nova Scotia and actually live in the same town as my best Marie again. We still bring this up to each other every now and again, but refrain from telling most anyone else out of fear of being labeled crazy. My last words I'd like to say are pretty blunt. If you live in Nova Scotia, Canada, please be careful. There is something living in the woods, and it is not human. Thanks a lot for watching the video. Till the end, subscribe to Horror in Detail for more videos. Drop your suggestions in comment section.